What's up guys? Today I'm going to show you how I built this modern shelf with a splash of rustic charm. This project uses only dados and rabbets, so there's no mechanical fasteners, just glue. So for this build today we're using rough pine. If you have the tools, rough wood is about half the price of finished wood. So an extra hour or so of labor brings down the cost of material by about half. I tried to pick a few boards that had lots of character in them. These are true 1x12s. The first thing I did was cut them down to the rough lengths. The reason they get cut down to rough lengths instead of final lengths first is there isn't a reference for square. So you'll need to come back and chop a bit off once you have a straight edge. Also, smaller pieces of lumber are just easier to handle. I'd rather run 4 2-foot sections through a table saw than try to struggle with a full 8-foot piece, especially with my setup. I love this old school Hitachi miter saw. It's got an 8 1/4 inch blade and cuts about 12 1/2 inches. I recently purchased a used DeWalt 12-inch miter saw, but that doesn't replace this one, and I won't be selling it anytime soon because this one's perfectly set up for square and kind of acts like a radial arm saw. Once I had all my rough lengths, I ran them through the planer. Even though they're rough sawn, they're pretty flat. Flat enough that you can run them through the planer without having to worry about a warped finished board. It was a lot of planing, so much so that I filled my 15-gallon shop vac up 4 times. I had to take a 1/4 inch off of every board to get them to their final thickness of 3/4 inches, and there was about 28 board feet in total, meaning I took off 7 board feet of material. That's pretty crazy when you think about it. Next, I pulled out my jointer. It's not the greatest jointer in the world, but it does a decent job. I bought it used for $90, and that's including the cart it sits on. The blades definitely need sharpening, and the bed is only 24 inches long. Combine that with a 3-inch tall fence, and it makes it really hard to run 4-foot boards through it, especially if they're 12 inches wide. This was the first job I used it on, so I was still working out all the kinks. While edging these boards, it lost square just enough that I didn't notice until the straight edge was up against the table saw fence. Not a big deal though, as I could still cut the rough edge with the table saw, then flip it around and run the freshly ripped edge against the fence, squaring the other edge up. And I gotta say, it's nice to have a project where all the boards are the same thickness and width. So with 2 parallel edges and faces, I could go back over to the miter saw and cut these boards to their final lengths. Needing multiple boards at the same length, it's much easier if you can cut them at the same time, so that's what I did. Then used some squeeze clamps to hold the pieces together while I moved it over and cut the other end. This isn't a technique or anything I learned from anyone else, it's just a bit of common sense combined with Home Depot having 2-inch squeeze clamps on sale at the bin at the cash right as I checked out. With all the boards at their final dimensions, it was time to cut rabbets and dados. I don't have a dado stack, but using a saw blade will work just the same. It will take a lot longer but produces the same result. So I set my blade to a 1/4 inch. This is going to be the depth of all the dados and all the rabbets. Then I set the fence to 3/4 inch and made my first pass. The nice thing is that I was able to do all 4 cuts before adjusting the fence. With the rabbets test fit and looking pretty good, I began to cut the dados in the sides of the shelf, as well as the dados in the shelves themselves that support the shelf dividers. This again was easy as the shelves were equally spaced, so I could make all 4 cuts at the same time. After literally cutting into the night, I finally managed to get them all done. The next morning I started sanding. I sanded everything with 80 grit followed by 120 and then 220. And a lot of people have different opinions on this. I feel a microfiber towel is the right way to go when it comes to getting rid of all the sawdust. Once it was dust free, it was time for the glue up. The glue up happened in 3 stages, and the only reason that it happened in 3 stages is because of lack of clamps. Everything slid into place as it should. Once I had light pressure with the clamps, I used a rubber mallet to whack the shelves until they were perfectly flush on both sides. And if you don't have a rubber mallet, don't worry. You can always use a good old 16-ounce hammer and just a piece of scrap wood. It's just to avoid denting the project you've worked so hard on. Everything fit together fairly well, but there were a few small gaps that required some wood filler. The shelves were cut just a hair too short, so I used a cutoff from the table saw and glued it into the dado before adding the shelf. And once the glue had hardened, I was able to cut the rest off with a flush trim saw. The shelf dividers went in easily. They were actually slightly too long, so I took out the miter saw and cut just a hair off at a time until they slid in perfectly, then glued them all into place. Once all the glue had dried, I took it out for its final sanding. I concocted some of my own wood filler from using sawdust from the sander and some glue to fill in the crack at the top. These cracks can be impossible to see when purchasing rough lumber, but extremely visible once the wood is surfaced. This homemade wood filler trick along with the finish should hide the crack pretty well. You'll see at the end of the video, but you pretty much have to be looking forward to see it. With the shelf sanded, I wiped everything down and got it ready for finish. To get a slightly darker gray than Verithane's Weatherwood Accelerator, but keep a wood feel to the shelf, I used carbon tinted Danish oil. I've never used this before and I'm still new to Danish oils, but I was pleasantly surprised with the result. Pine itself is hard to stain. It can look blotchy, but even with a wood conditioner, you still get darker and lighter spots. As far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, this comes down to the varying amounts of compression between the fibers of the wood. The more compressed fibers soak up less of the oil, and the less compressed fibers soak up more of the oil. To get a more consistent color, I think you'd have to use this on a nice hardwood like white oak. It would come out a bit darker, and the color would definitely be more evenly distributed. If you guys are ever wondering why you shouldn't push woodworking late into the night, it's because of things like this. Yep, that's right, I completely forgot to finish the exterior of the sides. So I applied a really thick coat of Danish oil to the sides, and then I applied a second lighter coat to the rest of the shelf. I opted for rubber feet over felt on the bottom of the bookshelf, mainly because the shelf is a stationary object. It's not meant to be sliding around like a chair would be. Plus, I like the look of these clear feet way more than circular white felt padding. I measured 1.5 inches in from each edge of the corner to find the spot where I'd put the feet. I pre-drilled holes so the wood wouldn't split, being extra careful not to drill through the bottom of the shelf. And with all that, the shelf is done. I really like the way it turned out. This is a personal opinion, but I think it's really hard to work with pine. Like, yes, it's easy because it's super soft and inexpensive, but I find it really hard to make the final product look good. Not to say that this looks bad, but instead of spending $2 a board foot for pine, I spend $4 a board foot and get a nice soft maple or birch or something like that. I think that would make it look way better. Either way, it was a really good learning experience. My dado confidence is now through the roof. And as promised, here's the crack filled in on top. It is visible, but keep in mind this is extremely zoomed in. From farther away, you can't see it at all. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what you saw, how about a comment or a thumbs up? Small things like that really help out my channel. And if you want to see more cool builds or tool and finish reviews, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching.